This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. Art has been used throughout Jewish history to promote Jewish life and to condemn it. In a study of how medieval art came to portray Jews with what we now see as basic anti-Semitic symbols, SUNY Stony Brook professor Sarah Lipton suggests that in many cases, life was imitating art in dark mirror the medieval origins of anti-Jewish iconography. But going back even further, there was a time when Judaism was at the avant-garde of aesthetics, putting forward poetry that broke rules and invented new ones. Duke University professor Lieber describes this trend in A Vocabulary of Desire, the Song of Songs in the Early Synagogue. But first, here's my interview with Sarah Lipton, explaining how Jews came to be wearing pointy hats. What you're doing with this book is in many ways kind of turning upside down common assumptions about anti-Semitism, where a lot of people just look at anti-Semitism and say, oh, it's just this broad brush thing. It's just, people hate Jews, so they come up with these things, and so they reflect that. But what you suggest is that, in fact, it's images of Jews that in many ways was able to foster specific types of anti-Semitism without anti-Semitism of that kind necessarily being the initial intent.
Yes, that's right. I'm not saying that images are the only place anti-Semitism existed or that they are responsible alone and solely for the creation of anti-Jewish feeling. But I think the role of images in creating anti-Jewish feeling and policies and actions has been very underestimated, and I really wanted to tell that story again and bring them back into the history. There's a difference between disapproving of Judaism, which Christians did from the very invention of Christianity because they differed on some very fundamental religious ideas, and hating Jewish people, a big difference. And one does not automatically slip into the other. And I think images played a fundamental role in making the connecting link between abstract ideas, disapproval of the way Jews read their text or disapproval of the ways reacted to Christ, and actual Jewish people walking around medieval Europe.
And you show this chronology of sorts, kind of these A-B matchups where image A turns up in certain depictions, say the year 1100, reality B shows up some years later. Yes. That whether it's the different signs that were imposed upon Jews, that they would have to wear hats or certain things.
Jews started to be shown wearing pointed hats sometime in the 11th century. I argue, after doing a lot of research, I can't believe how much time I spent reading about hats, or reading about the absence of any mention of hats. I spent a lot of time on hats to try and understand why Jews were shown with pointed hats, and I'm very convinced it's not because Jews walked around 11th century Europe wearing pointed hats. There's absolutely zero evidence for Jews doing that. After Jews are shown wearing pointed hats for decades and decades and decades, people start thinking we should be able to tell a Jew by looking at them and by seeing what they're wearing. And they look around Europe and they notice we cannot tell Jews by looking at them. Jews don't wear distinctive clothing. And finally in 1215, almost 200 years after the first image of a Jew in a pointed hat, we have legislation saying Jews need to wear distinctive clothing because it is important that we be able to look at them and tell who they are. And it wasn't until some decades after that, in 1267, we finally have two church councils saying that distinctive clothing should be pointed hats because that's what Jews' ancestors used to wear.
And now the early poetry of Judaism with Lieber. What you paint a picture of what it was like to deal with this text that you could read this way or that way, right at the beginning of it being incorporated into the Jewish canon. And the reaction at the time was, in one sense, more intensely allegorical, reading it as a love story between God and people, but then also more fluid because there was a sense that maybe all these loves are the same. Right.
There's a layering that occurs in these texts, and the Song of Songs was a powerfully evocative text. It's such a quotable text, even just these fleeting fragments. My beloved is mine, or let him kiss me with the kisses of his lips. All these phrases that are very forthright and evocative, and the way how you're going to understand those changes so much depending on who you think is saying the words, and the fact that we have these disputes about whether it was being sort of read very literally, in terms of like a barroom ditty, Or, is this very high allegory that the same words open themselves up to any number of readings?
If you're going to say on the one hand that love with God can be allegorized in this fashion, you're also saying kind of how you feel about the other end of that equation too.
So yeah, I think that's the best metaphor that they had for sort of this sense of real intellectual and emotional intimacy. And so I once had a professor who said that if the Song of Songs hadn't been written and put in the Bible, that they would have had to cobble it together from the prophets and other sources because they needed a text that said these things for them.
They do incorporate it into Jewish life in a very direct way, that it becomes the Passover book, right? Mm-hmm. And so paint the picture for us. What's going on in early synagogue life? Where are we? When are we? And what's happening as they're making this shift?
I think the texts I'm looking at cover a range of time from the 4th through the 7th centuries, and precisely what was going on in the individual synagogues is sort of a fascinating imaginative exercise to try to reconstruct a lot of what was going on, because in some ways these texts complicate and complement the picture we have from more familiar rabbinic writings. And I think what we get the sense of here is that it was very dynamic, that what was going on in the synagogues could really vary from place to place. And that certainly some places found the Song of Songs to be an incredibly powerful way of articulating, especially the Passover story and the idea of redemption, which, because of the allegory, gets retold almost as sort of an elopement between God and Israel, or sort of the lovers who are fleeing Egypt, comes chasing after them, and
the strict father figure chasing them with a stick. And
yes,
yeah.
And then they run to Sinai and get married. That it's sort of it takes on those very romantic overtones, which I think, especially in the context of late antiquity and the rise of the Christian empire and things, was a really powerful counter-narrative to the message that the Jews were receiving from the majority culture, and that the Passover, with its anticipation of liberation, it sort of plays into the archetypal story of the separated lovers, but promises that there will be a reunion.
That's all for this week's abbreviated web episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish channel on cable, or listen to the full audio of the show as a podcast available on iTunes and your favorite podcast player. The Jewish channel is available on cable: Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, Iowa Uplink Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.